Chapter 6 The Battle of Raukos. The high officers of Gilliman's crusade gathered on the command deck of the McCragg's Honor. They clustered around the dais occupied by the Primarch and his closest aides, crowding the command throne of Shipmaster Brahi that was set before it. Astra Militarium generals rubbed shoulders with the sister superiors of 3 battle convents. Adeptus Mechanicus Domini stood in clusters of orange, rust and blood-red robes. Space Marine lords waited with commissars, inquisitors, and the barons of knightly orders. Princeps had come down from their titans' steel skulls, ill at ease at being surrounded by so many people. There were naval wing commanders and captains of capital ships. Sisters of Silence stood aside from everyone else, their disquieting auras eliciting shudders from those nearest. The augments of Skitari clade commanders buzzed. Departamento Munitorum officials talked in low voices. Historiators recorded the occasion discreetly. Every branch of the Imperium's forces and those who supplied, directed, and supported them were represented there, whether in person or as one of the ghostly hololiths projected by the servo skulls, swarming above the throng. Through the grand oculus, the plow-blade brow of the McCragg's Honor pointed in challenge at the pit of Raukos. A huge, lazily turning interface between the warp and real space, wreathed in the luminous gases of a dying star. It was a place where nightmares might easily walk, clothed in flesh. The pit of Raukos was an anomaly set apart from the main storm front of the Great Rift, which divided the Imperium in 2. It was an isolated wound, but a deep one. It punched a hole through space-time and ran far into the heart of the warp. It was an area of bruised void, millions of kilometers across, glowing a sickly purple. Towards the middle, its coloration tended to putrid yellow-white, and at the very center, a vast, dark orb, striated like the iris of an eye, rotated with the speed and ferocity of a pulsar. At the edge of this blot on reality languished a star system. It had never been settled or given a name by mankind, but bore the Adeptus Astra designation of 108 Beta Calibus 9. The sun was a medium red star, dwarfed by the pit. Gravitic shear drew long blooms of incandescent gas from the star towards the anomaly. In the years since the Great Rift had opened, the sun had shrank by 1/10. The planets that orbited it were going dark. Tendrils of glowing matter twisted out from the fringes of the spinning eye, merging with and bending the surrounding star gas into looping whorls that reached towards the greater slash of the cicatrix maledictum, like parasitic worms migrating from their host. Such breaches between dimensions were once terrifying anomalies. In these dark times they had become commonplace. Whereas before they had been the Eye of Terror and the Lesser Maelstrom, now the Great Rift split the galaxy side to side, its depths interfacing directly with the Imperium, and 1,000 places like the pit of Raukos pierced the flesh of reality, disgorging unnatural energies. The pit was named after a demonic prince Gilliman had slain, From its churning depths came unnatural plagues and fleets of half-mad sentient vessels, crewed by children's nightmares. Ghostly armies of impossible monsters spilled gibbering into real space. Things spawned by the collective horrors of all history's thinking beings emerged from dark corners on worlds for light years around it. Most of these things only had a brief foothold in reality, and the more esoteric types dissipated as soon as they were birthed, smeared to glowing corpuscent by the laws of material physics. But nature's iron grip had loosened. The pit of Raukos was an open gate to the demonic legions of the greater powers, empowered by the wills of their dark gods and sustained by the unnatural energies of the rift. Armies of fell entities emerged from Raukos. The terror they generated fed them further, and so the cycle of horror continued. Gilliman stared unflinchingly into the unclean cyst of the pit. "Another lost system," Tribune Maldivar Colquan of the Adeptus Custodes spoke angrily. 5 others of his order stood guard behind the Primarch. When he spoke, and it was not often, it was as if every affront to the Imperium he saw compounded his shame. He was well aware that for 10 millennia the Emperor's bodyguard had done nothing. All he had to offer in response was gall. Gilliman privately agreed with this damning assessment. When he had returned to Terra, he had discovered a warrior brotherhood blinded by grief, uninterested in anything that happened beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace. Crisis after crisis had battered the foundations of the Imperium, and the Adeptus Custodes had retreated further from view with each one. They had finally come out from behind the palace walls. Small groups of them operated the galaxy over, but the pendulum had swung too far the other way. The Golden Warriors of Terra were in danger of being blinded by rage. "It was not lost because it never belonged to the Imperium," said Gilliman. "This target is nevertheless worthy, and we shall claim it as our own. See how the enemy gather around it. Their temple nears completion." A hololithic strategic display showed the system and its monstrous parasite as a series of neutral graphics tagged with data signifiers. It looked so bland, rendered that way, an innocuous nebula. The Chaos Fleet, around 108 Beta Calibus 9.2, was invisible to the unaided eye, but clear enough to the augurs of the McCragg's honor, and bright dots of light tagged with data screed swarmed at high anchor around a single point, the orbital fane of the Word-Bearers. The Primarch's voice needed no amplification to reach all of his commanders. His words carried into the furthest reaches of the command deck. When he spoke, all stopped to listen. "An orbital temple is under construction here. It must be destroyed. This is a staging post for our enemies, but it is for no mundane resupply that they come to the pit of Raukos." He pointed directly at the black eye in the anomaly. "They come here to make blood sacrifice, and call upon their diabolical gods to favor them with aid from their servants. From this rift, demons walk and lend their power to the traitors. Such doorways need closing. The ability to do so eludes us for now, but they will be closed, all of them. I swear this in my father's name. Until then, the monsters that come from within them will be beaten back, and the thresholds guarded by the mightiest warriors the Imperium can spare. So we shall divide the mortal servants of chaos from their unnatural allies. The Indomitus Crusade has swept from one end of the galaxy to the other, bringing retribution to our foes. I propose we add one further victory to our tally. The crowd cheered loudly. Booming transhuman voices joined with chittering data augmenters. The bit grew quickly in the Oculus as the fleet accelerated towards its target. The Indomitus Crusade was vast in size. Dozens of capital ships led many subfleets. The artificial stars of their engine stacks flared brightly as they maneuvered into attack positions. Guilliman had the armada arranged like a five-toed claw. The long talons were individual battle groups, arrayed in lines to pound the enemy as they passed. The palm was a wall of ships, with the Macragg's Honor at its center. The Primarch intended to trap the foe against the mobile fortress of the palm, as the fingers of the claw slowed and closed, as surely as a clenching fist, around the rear of the enemy fleets. A further battle group ran outwards from the main line of advance towards the pit. Within the knot of vessels at its center, the null ships of the Sisters of Silence flew, protected by 3 battleships. Kilometers long, the battleships were cathedrals of war, unused to escort duty, but the move was justified. For the foe they faced, these mighty vessels were not the battle group's deadliest weapon. The ships of the Sisters, large, black, and swift, were the key to success. The command crew of the Macragg's Honor was a mixture of standard human, Space Marine, and Primaris Space Marines. Humans predominated. Though they wore the uniforms of Ultramar, they had been gathered to the Indomitus Crusade from all across the Imperium. Their diverse origins had been no barrier to Guilliman forging them into an effective unit. Above the Vox pits, the Master Divulgatus swung his command pulpit around. Tall banks of organ pipes, each one a powerful voxmeter, hid him from the neck down. His head was encased in a bulky communications unit. Only his mouth was visible. "The null ships will be in position in an hour, my lord." "Seconded," said the Master Augurum from his own station, high up on the stepped walls of the command bridge, a sub-kingdom of screens and hardwired servitors. The runic icons blinked on the hololithic Taciternium orb, dotted lines flickering into being, describing their trajectory and ultimate position. Before the Crusade, the Macragg's Honor had undergone an extensive refit in shipyards of the Ring of Iron around Mars, and the command deck had been entirely reconfigured from Guilliman's day. Archmago's Call's stamp was on everything. New machines and unheard configurations of old devices replaced equipment that had been in use for tens of centuries. The tech priests had been outraged, but Guilliman had silenced them, and Call had had his way. The result was worth upsetting the Adeptus Mechanicus's religious sensibilities. The machinery still had the ugly look of 41st millennium technology, but Guilliman reckoned there was a 10% increase in tactical responsiveness alone. Multiple redundancies and newly integrated systems allowed for better survivability. Dozens of tech priests from Call's faction labored to keep the Archmagos' finely balanced design working. But it did work, and excellently so. "My lords and ladies," said Gilliman, "today will be a great day for the Imperium. I commend you to the protection of the Emperor, the Lord of mankind. Now go to your vessels and war machines, to your transports, to war." "War, war, war," they responded. The majority of the commanders left quickly. Hololiths blinked out. Soon the command deck was empty, but for Gilliman's core command staff and the ship's bridge officers, though that still amounted to almost 400 people. About the graphic of 108 Beta Calibus 9.2, the dull red signifiers of enemy craft began to move. "The enemy responds," said Gilliman. "All fleet to engage full thrust. We fall upon them without mercy." Shipmaster Brahe stood from his throne and leaned upon the array of view screens that clustered about his station. "Macrag's honor to full thrust," he said. "All fleet to full thrust." "All fleet to full thrust," repeated the Master Divulgatus to his opposite numbers across the fleet. A ripple of activity spread out across the tiered workbanks and station pits of the deck. Field integrity technicians adjusted the energy matrices that stabilized the ship's frame, compensating for the coming acceleration. Engineerium tech priests passed on minute adjustments to their counterparts deep in the ship's engine halls. Reactor outputs were carefully monitored. "Reactor ready," reported a metal-faced tech adept. "Engineerium ready," said a man in a smart ensign's uniform. A coterie of electro-priests began the hymn, "Body Electric." Tech priests muttered their prayers over their desks. The Master Motivatus gripped the rail of his podium. Around him, in a circular array, a dozen servitors sat. The calculations required to move the Macrag's honor from its current position into its attack run, flickering through their butchered brains. Cogitators bleeped out rapid beats of binaric as the data was transferred to them. "Compliance. Engines operating at maximum efficiency," the servitors said with one voice. "Full thrust in 3, 2, 1, mark," said the Master Motivatus. "Mark, engaging." A rumbling sounded aft, drawing closer like the approach of a great engine. A tremor passed up the ship, growing stronger. Machines blurbled as it passed through their fabric. It joined with the never-ending thrum of the ship's systems, became one with it, and passed from the crew's notice. Acceleration was a gentle push in the chest, a trailing heaviness that dragged at the heels. The Macrag's honor built up to 1/100th of the speed of light. Around it, the fleet's engines blinked into life as all the vessels began their acceleration, holding formation perfectly. 108 Beta Calibus 9.2 grew rapidly. The first round of projectiles came at them not long after. The smaller destroyers escorting the larger cruisers and battleships fired anti-munitions weapons in response. A series of pinprick explosions started up and soon became a constant accompaniment to the advance. A handful of torpedoes got through, dangerous for their kinetic energy more than the payloads they carried, but they exploded upon the void shields of the ships, hundreds of meters short of the hulls. The shields blinked and flashed as they shunted destructive energies into the warp. Gilliman watched without concern. Such long-range exchanges were never decisive, nor particularly damaging. He tapped out a few orders on a data slate to adjust the positioning, but for the moment the most important part of his plan was being performed correctly. The null ships were moving between the pit of Raukos and the planet. Their presence would disrupt any demonic incursion that might come through, while Sisters of Silence and Grey Knights Adepts Astartes were stationed across the fleet, ready to deal with any on-board manifestations. There would be no supernatural aid for the enemy. 108 Beta Calibus 9.2 grew larger and larger. It was a dull orange ball of a world with ice caps of frozen water. Miserable patches of green covered its equatorial regions, but in the main it was desert. Another low-grade world, too remote to settle. They were close enough now that the engine flares of the enemy were visible to the naked eye. The Chaos ships were spreading out, attempting to intercept the fingers of the Claw head-on. Gilliman watched their maneuvering. There was no one warlord in control. He could see that by the way the ships were operating. They moved in close groups, each warband sticking to its own. Chaos resisted authority. It was a weakness the Primarch had exploited time and again. 4 smaller groups struck out on their own, poorly coordinated with each other, and with the 5th, the largest group. This last formation made up the majority of the fleet, and its ships moved in good order, fanning out in a standard interception pattern towards the leftmost of the 2 leading Imperial battle groups. The challenge was there, in the Word-Bearers' fleet. They were behind the construction of many temples to the dark gods. Something of the scale of the orbital fane was rarely undertaken by other traders. The Word-Bearers were fanatical in their devotion, raising giant temples on the worlds they conquered, and they would fight to the last to defend them. The leading elements of Gilliman's fleet started firing as soon as they approached to within 1,000,000 kilometers. Broad spreads of torpedoes fanned out in intercepting patterns. Cannons hurled multi-ton anti-ship shells at the enemy. Such munitions would take minutes to arrive, and most would not hit their targets, but they were not intended to. Gilliman was closing off avenues of maneuver for the traitors with streams of explosives, forcing them into the positions he wanted. The second finger of his claw was intercepted by one of the smaller enemy battle groups. Both were traveling at such speed that only a brief flurry of broadsides was exchanged before their respective velocities tore them away from each other. The discharge of powerful Nova cannons obscured the combat. A brighter light suggested a reactor death had consumed a vessel. When the augers cleared and the light died away, the Imperial battle group was speeding on, leaving one of its cruisers wallowing of fire. The traitor fleet had come off worse, being badly mauled. 4 grand cruisers made up the core of its force, surrounded by a crowd of lesser ships. 2 of the cruisers had been hit hard. One listed off the flight path of its fellows, engines out, while fires burned all along the side of the other, and it was falling behind. The remaining 2 cruisers were coming straight for the flat wall of the Claw's palm. Gilliman's hands tapped out targeting data on his instruments. "Wall grouping Gamma. Target and annihilate traitor battle group," he said. The Master Divulgatus relayed his orders to the relevant ships. "They are rash," said Tribune Colquhoun. "They cannot get by us." "Perhaps," said Gilliman. "They may be attempting to disrupt our formation." "To damage 1 battle group, we have 7 and the wall of the claw palm." "Then to distract us, or perhaps there has been a falling out between their warlords. Or maybe they are running." Gilliman took his eyes from his displays and the Tacticarum to spare the Custodes a glance. "I make no assumptions. Neither should you. As he spoke, his scar itched, reminding him of the last time he had been in error, a situation the Primarch had sworn privately never to repeat. Colquhoun's lip curled. He disliked being lectured on tactics. Guilliman did not relent. Though they remained superlative individual warriors, the Adeptus Custodes had rarely served as generals since the old times, and centuries of isolationism had dulled what command abilities they had once possessed. Never underestimate the enemy, Colquhoun. 9 times out of 10, a mixed group of traitors will be disorganized and internally divisive, but the 10th time they will surprise and destroy you. Their greatest lords can forge the most antagonistic warbands into a devastating fighting force. Their intentions here are counter-envelopment and delay. Their sorcerers will be attempting to summon demonic allies, while their battle fleet keeps us occupied. He glanced at his Concilia Psychona, several Space Marine and Primaris librarians stationed close at hand. The mortal humans looked pained by the nearby Sisters of Silence. It is so, confirmed their leader, Codicere Donus Maximus, of the Aurora chapter. There is a weakening in the Veil. The warp is unquiet. Then they are attempting to bring in warp-spawned aid. It will not help them. Guilliman put from his mind the unspeakable things the sorcerers would be doing. The creatures of the gods would only come to offerings of blood, souls, and pain. My lord, said the Master Augurum, primary target will be within range in 10 minutes 9 seconds. He's 50 seconds off in his estimation, said Colquhoun. If you prefer, you can take his place, Tribune. Colquhoun made a dismissive noise. The main body of the Chaos Fleet was coming into range of the Imperial battle groups. The various signifiers of each enemy vessel acquired screeds of tagged data as the augurs of the fleet gathered more information on them. 5 ancient battleships formed the core of the chief grouping. There were of the Word-Bearers Traitor Legion. 3 were of the Word-Bearers Traitor Legion, as Guilliman had expected. The remaining 2 belonged to the Iron Warriors. Ancient beacons in their corrupted hulls broadcast codes dating back to the Great Crusade. Guilliman recognized the names of 2 of the ships. The fleet of Chaos often differed to those of the Imperium, incorporating many classes of ship no longer produced. Their battleships were spearheaded things, sleek and deadly, superior patterns from a more enlightened time. The remaining 3 subgroups of Chaos vessels were speeding past the outstretched fingers of the Claw to get behind the Imperial fleet and engage their vulnerable rear. One flotilla bore the markings of the Lords of Pain, a once loyal chapter whose full strength had turned to chaos during the Noctis Aeterna. The rest were motley collections of pirate vessels and mixed ships from traitor legions and other renegades. The 3 lesser battle groups could be ignored for now. Space Marine ships were line breakers, intended to crash through enemy lines and deliver their warriors to the surface before disengaging. They were less effective in void combat. The battleships were a bigger problem. They had arrayed themselves into an arrowhead that stepped up as it went back. A formation like that could do serious damage to the wall, as the 2 formations passed through each other. As one, the enemy opened fire with their prow weapons. Lance beams slashed across the void, splashing to blinding displays of displacement energies on the void shields. A glancing blow off the McCragg's honor. Forward shield lit up the deck with lilac energy discharge. The energy waves from an off-target Nova cannon shot sent ripples of sparks over the shields of the 6 ships nearest the flagship. "They are targeting our position," said the Master Augurum. "Any fool can see that," muttered Colquhoun. The Tribune's contempt for baseline humanity troubled Guilliman. "You have spent your life guarding the Emperor, yet you forget who the Emperor guards in his turn," said Guilliman. "Be more forgiving." "As you wish," said Colquhoun. Traditionally, the Adeptus Custodes had taken orders only from their own officers and the Emperor. That was until Guilliman had been declared Imperial Regent, the Emperor's living voice. "Hold course," Guilliman ordered. "All power to forward void shields. Battle groups 3 and 5, break off and engage outflanking enemy elements. Target all Lords of Pain chapter assets. All fleet to fire on targets of opportunity as subsidiary enemy groupings pass. All batteries load for close range combat. Prepare prow weapons for forward fire. Charge lance batteries to maximum. Nova cannons to draw firing solutions ready for my order." Various stations reported their understanding of Guilliman's order. Activity on the command deck intensified. On the forward oculus, the ships grew from flecks to objects the size of models, then bigger, swelling as the Indomitus Crusade fleet swept in at high speed. Perspective in the void lies. When the ships seemed close enough to touch, they continued to grow. Their spear prows went from scalpel-sharp to giant, blunt cliff walls, bristling with sensor spikes and weapons cupolas. "My lord," asked Brahi questioningly. "No order to fire," said Guilliman. A storm of laser and solid-shot fire blasted from the forward batteries of the Chaos ships. Guilliman ignored it and swept his gaze over the enemy, seeking weak points no augurs could see. Another barrage of lance strikes sparked off the forward shields. The majority of fire was coming at the McCragg's Honor, the Chaos battleship's adjusting position to track its approach. "Forward void shields failing," called out the Master Scutum. "We have multiple target locks on the flagship," reported the Master Augurum. "My lord," said Brahi again. He was remarkably calm, more curious to see what the Primarch would do than anything. Men like Brahi were rare. "A moment," said Guilliman. His fingers danced along the gel screen, the giving material distorting as he touched it. Schematics and augur data flashed up in quick succession on phosphor displays and minor hololiths. Guilliman read each page quicker than a man could blink, processing volumes worth of data in seconds. There. A void shield flicker, out of syncopation with its pulse modulators. A weak spot. "That vessel, the Steel Lord," he said decisively. "Target these positions." His hands danced over his displays, depressing keys and activating holomarks in a blur. An image of the Steel Lord materialized upon a secondary hololith in front of Brahi's throne. Targeting data for a score of ships appeared almost as quickly. The orders were disseminated via data squirt across the fleet. A flurry of affirmations were returned via the Master Divulgatus. "All vessels confirm targets acquired." "Then open fire," said Guilliman. The reserved fire of 10 great ships of the line flared out at once, all aimed at the Steel Lord. Battleships could withstand hours of pounding. Layered void shields protected their hulls, and the hulls themselves were meters thick, their vital cores hidden deep inside. Even gutted, a battleship might be salvaged and fight again, for their frames were forged from adamantium. But a Primarch was in command of the Imperial fleet, and as a master napper knows how to strike a flint just so to cause it to split, so Roboot Guilliman knew how to slay a starship. One tiny weakness was exploited, and the ship was cracked wide by overwhelming firepower. The The Steel Lord's void shields were overwhelmed instantly, undone by the frequency flicker in their generators. Lance beams spread themselves as golden pools before the shields gave out with a guttering brandy fire. Thousands of tons of solid and explosive ordnance followed. The Steel Lord weathered the impacts for a good 20 seconds before the sparking fires on its hull gathered into one giant eructation of flame that broke its spine. A second later, the reactor blew. A miniature sun engulfed the ship in a perfect yellow sphere. The oculus of the McCragg's Honor dimmed in response. The edges of the reactor nova touched the shields of the Steel Lord's sister ships, bringing them down in storms of squirming purple lightning. The Imperial fleet had not slowed, and the enemy ships were vast in their oculi. "All ships, engagement maneuvers," commanded Gilliman. "Fire at will." Expertly, the formation of the palm broke apart, passing between the enemy vessels. The McCragg's Honor punched through the boiling cloud left behind by the Steel Lord. Wreckage flashed to nothing on its void shields, and then the Imperial flagship was through, its guns raking down the sides of the exposed Chaos vessels. The Imperial ships fired their broadsides. The Chaos ships fired back, but 2 of the remaining 4 were shieldless, and they peeled away, venting flaming atmosphere. As the palm wall went through the enemy formation, the 3 fingers of the claw not engaged with the lesser fleets had turned and were coming back, firing directly at the vulnerable engine stacks of the Chaos vessels. A titanic explosion rocked one into an uncontrollable spin as its stacks went up. It rolled away, missing its stern. There were no cheers on the deck of the McCragg's Honor. All worked to ensure victory. Celebration could wait. The Chaos formation was disrupted. The fingers of the claw harried the remaining 3 battleships and their escorts as the palm raced on toward the orbital platform under construction at 108 Beta Calibus 9.2's highest orbital anchor. The Vane was far from finished, but its basic framework was in place. An 8 pointed a star like a compass wheel, the symbol of the priests of the dark gods, called the Octed. Strange lights played about its center. As fire flashed behind them, the ships of the palm approached unopposed. The light about the hub of the Wheel of Chaos shone brighter. 90 degrees to starboard, ordered Brahe. Show it our big guns. Target enemy battle group with the port side batteries. The ship rumbled around as torpedoes from the smaller craft accompanying it raced towards the Octed. The turn was performed in the face of decelerative force, and the vehicle moaned as it was forced around, but it was done quickly. The orbital moved out of view of the forward oculus. Side views were brought onto the main hololith Tacticarium. "Open fire!" roared Gilliman as the ship lined up. "Bring it down!" Banks of macro cannons boomed in series along the side of the battleship, their recoil making the command deck shudder. Energy had to be diverted to the integrity fields that held the ship together, so great was the violence of the guns, combined with that of the turn. Giant munitions slammed into the incomplete temple station, pruning it of spear-tipped arms and breaking its hub. Bombs designed to kill whole worlds were deployed to ensure its demise. After 2 volleys, all that remained of the Octed was an area of spinning orbital debris 1,000 kilometers across and still expanding. "And so they see no fane to their dark gods will they raise, that I shall not cast down," said Gilliman. "These traitors oppose the will of the Emperor's last faithful son. They will learn the error of their ways. 10,000 years some of them have defied the Emperor. Their lives end now. There was no vessel powerful enough to defy the McCragg's honor. There were a few remaining Chaos battleships, and under different stars they might have been a match for the venerable flagship. But the Imperial fleet outnumbered the traitors, and Gilliman wielded his armada expertly. The traitors were disunited. The last battleships were quickly isolated, unwilling to act in concert at first, then rapidly made unable to do so. The disparate battle groups of the Chaos Fleet could do nothing to halt the McCragg's honor, as it powered through the debris field of the Temple Station and towards the world beyond. As the Imperial fleet swung into orbit, the stratosphere flashed to the discharge of ground-based defense lasers. The McCragg's honor rocked to the impact of multiple hits. "Master Divulgatus, send my words to the fleet," said Gilliman. "My lord," the Master Divulgatus replied. "The station is destroyed," said the Primarch. "The way is open. All landing ships move forward. Begin deployment of main ground attack. In the face of their fire, put down your armies and your legions. Generals of the Imperium, it is time to scour this world clean."